I knew there was a God because I knew and saw him work in the lives of so many that my dad pastored and was encouraging. But I felt like God picked favorites, and I just wasn't one of his favorites. My name is Tacyana Nixon, and I grew up in Manchester, New Hampshire. My father is a pastor, Pastor Carl Berman, and my mother was a fashion designer, is a fashion designer. Grew up in an Adventist home. My parents both became into Adventism in their teenage years, both coming from pretty strict Haitian backgrounds, and so our home was very strict as it came to our beliefs in God and our picture of God. At a very young age, I was abused, and so I really believe that that experience at such a young age altered my picture of God. My parents were just doing everything they possibly could to reach me, because at the time I not only wasn't doing well in school, but I would say that I wasn't making the right life choices. Not to say that I was out doing anything crazy. I was just very cold and bitter, and at times I didn't know why. I just had developed such an angry, calloused heart over the years from believing in a God who chose favorites. And so I remember my parents just seeking to help me come into a better space. Invited me to be a part of this mission trip with one of their best friends, Pastor Haystack, out in northern New England. And I remember them saying, you can go to India, and it's going to be an amazing experience, and you can share about Jesus, and you can sing and do evangelism. And I remember thinking at that point, like, I just want to get out of this house, so sure, like, I'll go on this mission trip and tell people about Jesus that I genuinely at that time didn't believe was relevant to everyone. And I remember going and preaching about Christ and singing these songs about Christ as I did at home, and just not allowing those things to really penetrate me. It was all just, in many ways, for show. And I'll never forget one night, it was probably about 1:30, 2 a.m., and I got a knock on my hotel room door, and it was from one of the young people who were on the trip, and he basically said, you know, they're killing people in the other villages, and we need to pack up our stuff, and we need to leave. And I was terrified. And I remember going back into the room and beginning to just pack all my stuff as quick as I could, and this thought came to my mind, and the thought was, you need to get back home, because if you don't, your sister is gonna get all your stuff. Like, someone had just told me that I might die, and all I can think about is my stuff at home. I remember as I was just packing all this stuff, this voice spoke to me like as clearly as I'm speaking right now, and it said, if you were to die right now, what would people remember you for? What would be your legacy? And as that thought hit me, I just remember kneeling there on the floor and beginning to cry, because I would be remembered as someone who was mean, as somebody who wasn't honest, as somebody who didn't care about others. And I remember just praying and saying, God, I know you can hear me, and if you bring me back to the States, like, I will live my life in a way where people won't remember me, but they'll remember you, like in my actions and what I say and what I do. And so, like, by his grace, of course, I was able to return home, and I remember having to just go into my parents' room and be honest with them about where I was, where my heart was, be honest with them about the abuse that had taken place, about the lies I had told. I remember walking back into my room and just kneeling on the floor and weeping, because I thought that if I had finally been honest about who I was and where my heart was, that I'd feel this burden lifted from me. And I remember feeling so heavy. I thought if I'd just come clean, everything would be okay, but I still felt so heavy. And I remember just weeping on the floor and feeling this push toward that window. And I remember standing, finding myself, I didn't even know how I got there, but standing on the ledge and the window was open. And I felt something pushing me forward. And I felt myself falling down. Mind you, this is 4 stories up. And I remember just crying out, just Jesus, just yelling it out. And before I knew it, I was back on the floor by my bed, just weeping again. And I'll never forget just saying to myself, God, if you're real, I need to feel your warm embrace. I need to know that I'm forgiven. I need to know that I can rise up from this place and that everything's gonna be okay. I need to know that there's a purpose for me. I need to know that you have a plan for me. And I'll never forget feeling this warm embrace. And when I turned around, my father was standing there and he was hugging me. The embrace was too real. I was like I'm about to turn around and see God, and it was my dad. And from that moment on, I didn't know what the call in my life would be, but I knew that there was a God who loved me desperately. And Jeremiah says it. He says, I have loved you with an everlasting love, and that's God's love for us and over us. And I knew there was a call on my life, and I didn't know what that would look like, but I knew that God had a plan for me. And so that plan brought me to Andrews University, and it was my first time being in an Adventist space. And I remember my advisor, probably midway through my semester of Greek, telling me, you probably should change majors, because not only is Greek seeming to overwhelm you and be too hard for you, but also there's not a lot of women pastors. There's not a lot of women in ministry. And so you really should consider doing something else. So I did. I changed to religion, and I changed to public relations. And I said, God, if you're calling me, like I know you have been, then you'll make a way for me to pastor or serve in whatever capacity that you've called me to. And so I graduated in 2013, in March in 2013, and I was the only person in my graduating religion theology class to be picked up as a pastor, even with a religion and public relations degree. And I went to New Jersey Conference, and there I was the first and since I think only woman to pastor New Jersey Conference, and I had the privilege of pastoring there for 4.5 years. It was the Sabbath after the vote in 2015 against having women be ordained within our denomination, and I was supposed to preach that Sabbath, and I remember not wanting to, but knowing that I had to, knowing that my call isn't dependent on what anybody says. I heard it distinctly from God, and I need to walk in that boldly and confidently. And so I stood before my congregation and I preached my heart out on the call that God has on each and every single one of our lives to serve Him and to make His name known. And at the end of the sermon, I saw my head elder come forward. And then I saw another elder come forward. And then I noticed everyone was getting up from their seat and walking forward. And they laid their hands on me and they prayed for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on my life. And I'll never forget feeling so loved and cared for, not only by them, but by God. And knowing that from that moment on, no matter where God led me, that I was not only called by Him, but ordained by Him to serve and to care for humanity. I've been led into different spaces, one that I'm in right now where I am not standing behind a pulpit every Sabbath. And I had to learn that the gospel isn't your hat, it's your skin. I can't just rest on the reality of having a pulpit. I need to rest in the reality that wherever I walk, the gospel goes with me. Wherever I stand, it stands with me. Wherever I lead, it's leading me. And that I'm called to much more than what the church or anyone has said or put limits to. It has been really difficult kind of stepping away from that space because it makes you question, at least for me, being back in school makes me question, like, do you still call me? Do you still love me? Am I still worthy in many ways? And God has reminded me time and time again of that moment when He called people forward to pray for me and to remind me at one of the lowest points in my life that I'm forever called and His Spirit is forever with me and upon me. For those who feel discouraged and feel like the church has let them down in many a way, I like to liken Christ to the groom and his church as the bridegroom, and me as bride, and him even as my groom, being a part of this church. I think of my vows, and I think on my wedding day, and I think about the promises that I made. And I know that I made them before God, and I like to think as if God was there making them also to me. Death do us part, for better or for worse. And I think of my baptism and making that decision before him and before my congregation, before the congregation, and almost saying to God and also to my church, like, for better or worse, till death do us part, like, I'm gonna work with every fiber of my being to make this work, to know that I'm not only committed to God, but I'm committed to knowing him in a deeper way, and knowing that the doctrines that I've learned within the Seventh-day Adventist Church are so far the deepest way I've come to see the clearest picture of Christ, and to see the clearest picture of my groom is a beautiful thing. So knowing that I've met him here, knowing that I found him in this space, in this church, it's for better or for worse. It's for better or for worse, and I will try with every fiber of my being, and I encourage you too to try with every fiber of your being, if this is where you found him, if this is where you see the clearest picture of him, to stay and to make it work. And when things seem like they can't be worked out, to work a little bit harder, knowing that Christ has called you here and that he's working to change his church too. My name is Tacyana Nixon, and I am a preacher.